Hey everyone, and welcome back to Watercolor Wednesday here on Art a la Carte. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking to you guys about watercolor paper. Now, if you've gone into an art store, you might have been maybe a little overwhelmed at the paper selections. There's tons of different types of paper, and they all have these funny, weird names. And if you're not familiar with art terms, it can be a little confusing. So I'm going to take you through some of the papers that I recommend to start off with, and then some of the papers that I use in some of my paintings. So let's get started. Even if you're just starting off in watercolor, I would recommend to purchase some watercolor paper, and a nice quality watercolor paper at that. You can sometimes find really cheap watercolor paper at like dollar stores and things like that, but when it comes to the art world, you really get what you pay for. And so if it's a lower price for something, it's probably going to be a lower quality. So let's first talk about what's the difference between watercolor paper and other papers. For my first example here, I have just a plain piece of printer paper, and I'm going to show you what happens when you watercolor on just regular printer paper. At first, the paint goes on okay with it, but you're going to see that it doesn't spread like it needs to with regular watercolor paper. You're going to see kind of that lining that you get. I don't know if you've ever played with markers and you go over top another marker and it gets hard to blend things out. You get the different layers. You're going to find that first of all with paper that's not watercolor, that it doesn't want to blend as well. It takes a lot more work. The next thing you're going to notice is as I'm painting on this paper, I'm getting what's called a warp, where I'm getting this wave going on here. As the water is absorbing into the fibers of the paper, it causes it to expand. So it expands here, but it's not expanding over here because it's not wet yet. So it's causing this warp effect. And a lot of papers will do that. The next thing that you're going to find is as you begin to apply this paint, you can only get a couple strokes and then you're starting to damage your paper. And you'll notice that my paper is getting really thin. You look at it, if you look at the back, it's already bleeding through the back. And as I begin to pull on this paper, you're going to see it beginning to ball up here. And so this paper can't take much abuse. As it gets a crease, the paint is drawn to that crease, and I'm going to have a really hard time smoothing that out. So my recommendation is printer paper is probably not the best thing to start off with, and even I will rarely ever do any kind of watercolor on just regular printer paper. And if I do, it's definitely not going to be anything professional. It might just be just a swatch for fun to figure out color schemes or something, but it'll be just a scratch piece. So I wouldn't recommend watercoloring on printer paper. So here is a piece of watercolor paper right here, and right at first glance it really looks like a normal piece of paper. When you start to feel it, you're going to know it's much thicker. It's kind of like a cardstock, and it usually has a really kind of a bit of a rough texture to it. But what really makes watercolor paper special is the way it reacts to water. It absorbs it but doesn't expand as much as other papers do. So you're not going to get as big of a warp as you would with just regular drawing paper. So as I lay my colors down, you can see that it flows. It's going to spread the paint out evenly. It's not going to keep it all in just that stroke. Even after a couple minutes of being on the brush, I can still blend that out and make it all very nice and even. You're also going to notice as I apply more water to it that that buckling that you saw in the first paper isn't really as prevalent in this one. After a while, this will have a little bit of a buckle, especially if I put a lot of water on this. But as it dries, it can dry very, very flat. Here's a watercoloring that I did on a piece of watercolor paper, and you can see it has a little bit of a warp texture, but it doesn't have that ripple throughout the whole piece. And when framed and matted, this is going to lay very nicely. A suggestion I have is after you finish watercoloring and after it's dry, that you go ahead and press these. And I usually just find a couple really big heavy books and put them in between the pages of the books after it's dried a little bit, so it's not smearing your paint. And then as it finishes drying, it's going to help dry it nice and flat. You're also going to notice that as I lay in other colors that it's going to be able to fade and blend really nicely, where with other paints you're not going to get that nice gradient effect that you're looking for. The other nice thing about this is as I continue to stroke over top of this, it can take a lot of abuse. I can do a lot of stuff to this paper and it's going to withstand and it's going to hold up. It's not going to ball up on me. It's not going to tear through for a good while. I can do a lot to this paper. So it's like the tank paper. It's really tough, and you can have a lot of fun. Now, what am I painting? I have no clue. I'm just putting colors down because it's fun. So once you have some paper, I encourage you to get some paint and just start playing around with it. See how your paper reacts, because you're going to find different brands react a little bit differently. So I would suggest just trying out different brands until you find the brand that you really like, that you go, oh, that brand really, I like how that flows on that. So with that, let's talk about different brands of watercolor paper. While I let this masterpiece dry. And no, this piece will not be for sale on my Etsy shop. So this is going into my private collection, so you can't buy it. Never buy it. It's mine forever. Okay, if you want to pay me $100, you can have it. So this brand here is probably the brand that I use probably the most, is Carte watercolor paper. This tablet here is 5.5 by 8.5 inches, and it's 140 pounds. And that's going to be a really common weight in watercolor, is about 140 pounds. Anything less than that is going to not be strong enough to handle it. So you want to look for that. This particular tablet came with 12 sheets and regularly cost about $6.50 at the time that I purchased this. But I always try to get mine on sale, so I got this one for $5.19. So woohoo! Yeah. And I've done a couple paintings already in here. You can either keep them in the tablet or, you know, tear them out. There's another little swatchy piece for one of my watercolor classes I was teaching. So if you can find a Carte brand watercolor paper, that's a really good brand. And so it's not super duper expensive to purchase a little tablet of this, and this will give you quite a few cute drawings. So the next question is this the only thing you can watercolor on, is watercolor paper? No, it's not, but my recommendation is if you're starting out watercolor, stick with watercolor paper. Another paper that I use a lot is Bristol board, which is a very thick paper, kind of like watercolor. The difference lies in that it's very, very smooth texture. It does tend to not let the colors spread as much. You have to work a little bit faster. When you lay a color down, it's not going to blend out as much as you can with watercolor paper, and it tends to warp a little bit. So it's a little bit more challenging, but I really enjoy painting on it. It kind of gives me a different look to the watercolors. Here's a piece from an upcoming video tutorial, so another sneak peek on Pegasus that I drew, but I did this on Bristol paper, and you can kind of see how the watercolors react to this. You can see a little bit of a different texture, how the paint lays on the paper. It's just, I don't know if you can kind of tell the difference. I can see the difference when I'm painting on watercolor paper. It's like here with this texture here, a little bit different as opposed to this texture here. Little differences. But as you get accustomed to watercolor, you're going to really notice the differences. And so if I want this kind of a finish to it, I'll use a Bristol paper with it as well. But no matter whether you use watercolor or Bristol, the biggest thing is that you're using something to watercolor on, because you're not going to get any better unless you're actually watercoloring. Hopefully this kind of helped answer some of the questions of what is watercolor paper, and what kind of paper should I use to watercolor on, and blah 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 blah. So yeah, if you have any other questions about watercolor paper, leave those in the comment section below and I will try to answer those. Next week we're going to be talking about brushes, what kind of brushes to use, because there's a gazillion types of brushes out there as well. So I'm going to talk about how to find good brushes and how to take care of those brushes so they'll last you a long time. Well, thanks again for joining me, and until next time, God bless you guys, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.